My name is Rich Kohler. I have lived in the West Seattle Junction for 20 years. I raised a family. I have a 7-year-old, 11-year-old. I'd also like to introduce a gentleman named Tomas. He is known on the West Seattle blog as Avalon Tom. And if you've seen his work, he is. And so what I wanted to talk to you about today is a little bit more focus on what the sound transit experience could look like at the junction. And so I want to give you a little bit of background about the West Seattle Junction. If you're not from there, maybe you don't know the area. I'll walk you through Avalon Tom slides to give you almost a flyover narration of what it would be like with representative alignment. And we'll talk about some things that we, with the Junction Neighborhood Organization, have talked about internally about a proposal for how we might implement a tunnel solution in the junction that we might prefer. First, I'd like to get to know you a little bit better. How many of you live at or near the junction that are here today? About a third of us. And how many have shopped at the junction? Maybe you've gone there to have a beverage or two. Excellent. And how many commute through the junction? Maybe you take a bus that passes through the junction on its way somewhere else. It's about half the room. Okay, go to the next slide. So the junction actually has the name the junction because historically it was the connection between two streetcar lines. There's a streetcar line that ran from north from Admiral all the way south to a place called Endaline. And if you've ever eaten Endaline Joe's, you'll know that's where that streetcar used to end. And another streetcar came up from Avalon all the way down where Luna Park was. Luna Park was actually an amusement park back in the 1920s, and the streetcar went up and then met the other line running north-south at Alaska Street in California, and that's where the junction got its name. So the junction has historically been both a commercial hub as well as a transportation hub for the West Seattle Peninsula, and clearly that will continue into the future. In the 1990s, the West Seattle Junction was designated as what's called an urban village, and so an urban village to the city of Seattle means an area where we are going to concentrate investment for amenities and things like transit, as well as a concentration of where we would expect growth to take place. So as you have seen, if you've known the junction as well as I do, a tremendous amount of growth and change has taken place in the junction over the past 5 years or so. At this point, we've surpassed our goals for density. We have grown by almost 111% in terms of residential occupancy in the West Seattle Junction over the past 15 years. And we now have 4,000 households. We are, however, falling short on both employment and open space objectives that were set out when it was designated an urban village. Go ahead, next slide. A few things, a little bit about a background about how we approach design and the experience of the junction. They're guided by a few things that are on file with the city of Seattle. And one of those is the West Seattle Junction Design Guidelines, which are put into city ordinance through SMC 234104. And that describes a bit of the design parameters about how the junction should be experienced. And if you go to the next slide, this is a piece of that. And what you're seeing up here is actually the boundary of the West Seattle Junction Urban Village with a few zones carved out. Now, one thing that's interesting within this is that in 2016, the city of Seattle designated that spot to be the frequent transit hub for the West Seattle Junction. That is because it is the place where multiple bus routes cross, and that is the intersection of Fauntleroy and Alaska. As a result of that, in order to fulfill the transit-oriented development principles where people should walk to transportation if they can, the city is planning on adding this much additional area to the West Seattle Junction through a boundary expansion, which is planned for later this year, pending some legislation. Next slide. Another part of our design guidelines is an illustration of where the pedestrian experience should be. And what you can see in these dotted lines is that the fattest dots are what are described as major pedestrian streets. And so those are the areas that the designers of these design guidelines and the junction planners expected would have the most pedestrian traffic, and then the most investment would go into those pedestrian and likely bike experiences as well. In fact, if you're aware of that there was a plan to convert Fauntleroy Way from here to here into more of a boulevard, which included bike lanes and a treed median, that was put on hold as a result of the sound transit plans. However, that is actually descended from, and the reason that boulevard was designated is because in the 1990s when this was designated an urban village and these plans were made, that was kind of took a while, but getting around to the implementation of some of these pedestrian experiences. Next slide, please. If you live in the junction, you kind of know it has a wide variety of different spots within it that you might consider different zones within the West Seattle Junction. So you're probably familiar with California Avenue. That's the historic commercial district of the West Seattle Junction. It's a street, we close the street for parades. Maybe you've been there for the Memorial Day Parade. Maybe you've been there for Halloween trick-or-treating at the Junction. The farmer's market is on that street, and so on. So California Avenue is a very important cultural place for the Junction. There's also this area called the Triangle. Now the Triangle used to be a commercial zone, which was recently, I'd say recently meaning 5 or so years ago, I believe it was 2011, rezoned so that it could be a neighborhood commercial center, so that residences could be built there as well. And so you start to see some of the apartment complexes built there, such as the Nova apartment complex and so on, which were a result of that rezone. You can also see that a lot of development has taken place in the Triangle area. If you drive through there, you see a hole in the ground where there's a crane building a new apartment complex called the Foundry. You're aware that across the street there's going to be a Whole Foods with the Whitaker, that's a major apartment building, and then one for the LA Fitness building across the street. We also have some single-family zones here, which are a great way for us to mix up the experience of this neighborhood so that you get a diversity of housing options, which includes places to raise a family with yards, as well as the density associated to the commercial hub. Yes?
Are those single families scheduled to be changed during the hall upgrade?
They are currently nominated to be changed to low-rise as part of that.
Okay, thanks.
I invite you to read this quote from our design guidelines, which speaks to the importance or use of Alaska Street. And as we see the connections taking place within our neighborhood as it evolves, we know that the Triangle has an important future for us at the Junction. We know that California is an important commercial street for us. And what we think is really a great idea is for us to fulfill the design guidelines vision of connecting those two areas through a walkable street. Okay. Next slide. Another thing to draw from when you imagine what it's like to guide the design and the implementation of light rail in the West Seattle Junction is the Seattle Comprehensive Plan. The Seattle Comprehensive Plan incorporates neighborhood plans that were designed some years ago when those urban villages were created, and so still on file with the City of Seattle. And part of the comp plan are a total of 40 different policies and guidelines that outline what the characteristics are the West Seattle Junction is meant to have. And here's 2 of them. So you can refer to those if you wish. Okay, next slide. What we view it as a good set of priorities for sound transit implementation is to ensure that we retain a walkable urban neighborhood. We like to live in the West Seattle Junction. We like that it's a walkable neighborhood with a lot of places to shop and see. We don't want it to turn into a, let's say, suburban park and ride, for example. We like that there's a lot of commercial there. We like to see consistency with the neighborhood plans and things that have been adopted into law. We'd like to ensure that during construction it remains a viable neighborhood for both businesses and people, and with a centrally located station. Okay, next slide. Next slide. We've taken a look at the representative alignment, and we'll show it to you, and there are a few things that we're a little concerned about. One is, as you're probably aware, is that it's elevated, which means that it's supported by concrete pylons that can range anywhere from 50 to 160 feet in height, which we believe would have a significant impact on the pedestrian experience of our urban village. We also believe that we should not be tearing down a viaduct in one part of our neighborhood and then rebuilding a viaduct in the middle of West Seattle. Partly the reason that we're tearing down the viaduct on the waterfront is because it separates the waterfront from the rest of the city. And so we're concerned that the experience people would have within the West Seattle Junction, if it were elevated, is you'd basically bisect the West Seattle Junction into 2 parts. So we don't particularly care for that. We also know that a part of the plan is that the Sound Transit 3 included funding to study extending the light rail not only to the junction, but also to continue it to the south. And so when we look at the representative alignment, it appears to head off to the west instead of being able to turn south. So we're concerned about the viability of future expansion opportunities. We also have an open space issue that we may be able to address in part through the investment we're making in this area. Okay. I'll walk you through the elevated visuals that Avalon Tom prepared and put on file on the West Seattle blog, or at least thank you, Tracy, for posting this. This is an overview of what the 3 stations are currently planned for within the West Seattle side of the alignment. This is what we have taken from Sound Transit's own plans and maps, and this is known as the representative alignment. Now I'll fly you through along the path. Now, we are focused, so my portion of this conversation is focused on the West Seattle Junction. And so, whatever portion of is going on in Delridge, I think is a separate conversation. So I'm going to focus on that, and I'm going to pick it up from this point, which is the point at which, go back to the,
Yeah, right there.
yeah. So we're going to be right about, we're looking from about here in that direction on this image. So we're looking northwest over the golf course as the elevated rail enters the West Seattle Junction. This is Avalon Street right here. Okay. This is Genesee Street. And this is a height of about 160 feet. Okay. In the distance, you see Avalon Station. And now in this slide, we are going to go past that, turn around and look back from the other direction. So we're now actually looking back to the southeast. And so this is the location that's been proposed for the Avalon Station on the representative alignment. You can see here's the entrance to the West Seattle Bridge. This is 35th. This is Fauntleroy. You can see that the elevated alignment comes over into a place which is currently occupied by a number of homes and then continues elevated down Fauntleroy, noting that Fauntleroy is the very same street that carries not only a lot of traffic to the West Seattle Bridge, but also was designated as a pedestrian boulevard. We're not particularly happy about this particular location for the Avalon Street station. It's not particularly accessible from there, for one thing. It's blocked on one side by the West Seattle Bridge, and blocked on the other side by some fairly substantial development. So the access points to this is not particularly clear. Also, this is a very busy place. So if you're in there in the morning trying to get to work, you're aware that we're taking a lot of traffic through this on 35th in the morning and then back on Fauntleroy and so on in the evening. So this could be a very congested area even for things like bus connections. So we're not particularly happy with this location. Okay, keep going. Now we're actually on Fauntleroy looking north. And so if you drive, let's say from Morgan Junction, or you're driving in from the ferry and you're headed downtown, you're passing through this intersection, and this is Fauntleroy coming back, and then headed up west on Alaska Street. This intersection, if you drive through there frequently, you may be aware is becoming more congested as well, with the pedestrian activity that's taking place from these large buildings and the others that are going to be taking place in the triangle. The amount of pedestrian traffic crossing this is bound to get higher. And so what we're seeing is a lot more congestion and a lot more pressure on this particular intersection as cars, pedestrians, and other modes of transit all wish to use it. Next slide. Now we're looking directly west, and so west up Alaska Street. So what you see is, in this case, the distance, you see the station located midway as an elevated station. One thing to note is that the height of the station is 50 feet above the ground, and so by the time you've climbed up the station, you're probably about the 5th or 6th story of the adjacent apartment buildings. Okay. And if we were to look at it from the overhead, it would look like this. So this is the station. Now, what I've seen, however, is that the Sound Transit maps have been revised somewhat since their first representative alignment. And they are now showing that this station is moved roughly to this location. So they have made some slight modifications in the past month or so. This you can see is Jefferson Square, and this is Capco Plaza where the QFC is. Okay. The original representative alignment showed that there was a tail track. So the question is, why does the track continue after the past station? And the answer I got from the head of design was that the train needs to be able to turn around. And so the train would go past the end of the station, switch tracks, and then come back in the other direction. And that's why. I've also heard it possibly that it could be used in a case of an emergency if they had to push the train off the station and be able to continue service. As you can see, this is fairly disruptive to, at least visually disruptive, to the very same California Avenue that we use for our parades, our festivals, and so on. So it's a pretty significant structure. The other thing I'd point out is there's 2 landmarks. One of those is the Han building, which is where Easy Street Records is, and across the street where Cupcake Royale is the Campbell building. Both of those are landmarks, and they're unreinforced masonry, which makes them particularly vulnerable to disturbance. And so there's also a chance that we'd be disrupting our historic landmark as part of the construction for this particular tail track. Now the tail track in the most recent alignment actually ends here. So it looks like at some point they thought, well, why run the tail track all the way across the intersection? And so the latest maps show it ending right in front of the Campbell building as opposed to shooting across. Next one. However, nonetheless, there still might be some very significant concrete work in an area that we consider a very important intersection for our neighborhood. If you come during some of our festivals, you'll know that we have booths, we have kids rides, we have things like those set up at this very intersection. So this is probably ground zero. This is the epicenter of the West Seattle Junction, might be this particular intersection. And so we're concerned about the impact that this magnitude and mass of construction could have on the pedestrian experience in our neighborhood. Next slide. If you want a little style, we added some mildew and so on. One more slide is, this is what the artist rendition of what the end of the track might look like. Now, at the time the representative alignment was there, it just sort of ended in front of the Wells Fargo bank, and like I said, the more recent renderings have shown that that will actually end in front of the Campbell building to the immediate east side of the intersection. So what we just walked through very quickly is what the representative alignment looks like. This is the baseline. It is not too late to change it, but in order for the Sound Transit team to feel like we should come up with a different plan, they want your input. We have until May 5th to submit different ideas. After they get all the ideas they can by March 5th. Thank you, March 5th, which means that's only like a week and a half, so we don't have much time to get any kind of new ideas on the table, and they will then take a look at these ideas and build a set of what they call alternatives. And then in the ensuing months leading through 2018, they'll narrow the list of alternatives down to the ones that seem to have the most support and which meet the most criteria for what Sound Transit and wants to get out of the project. Okay, so part of what we're talking about here is if you like what you saw, then don't do anything, because that's a plan that is already on the record. If you think there are other ideas about how we could implement Sound Transit and light rail in the West Seattle Junction at least, then we have until March 5th to submit other ideas for how we might see this put in place. So we at JuNO have started to talk about this somewhat. In fact, I was pretty excited about, at the time where this resolution passed, when we voted for it in 2016, I jumped on board because I wanted to say, this is a great opportunity for us to build something that even my children will enjoy. This is something that will be as part of our neighborhood for hundreds of years. And if we get this right, we can have a really great neighborhood and an awesome Sound Transit experience for all of us. So I wanted to get involved and see what I could do to be a part of this. So we talked about some things. We talked with Tom, we talked to some others, and we came up with an idea that might look like a tunnel. So I'd like to walk through that with you as well. So one question about a tunnel is, well, where does the tunnel start? So take a look at the next slide. And so, notwithstanding anything happening to the east regarding Delridge or how it approaches, just starting from the entrance to the West Seattle Junction, we considered possibly 3 different alternative places where a tunnel could begin. The shortest possible tunnel might start here, right underneath where that totem pole is just east of Alaska Street. If that's the case, this tunnel is about a half a mile long, okay, which is relatively short. To get there, you have to take a track that goes either over the golf course, potentially down where the holes are not located, or potentially over the parking lot, and then find an entry point like that. Okay, so that's an option. Another option might be if you want to follow the same representative alignment that we just saw as closely as possible, you might be able to move this part of the alignment right into where that golf course is. At that point, you might be affecting a couple, maybe 2 or 3 holes of the golf course that might have to be redesigned and realigned, but right to the south of Genesee Street, you might find an entry point there. As you know, if you're from there, that Genesee Street is extremely steep, so you could imagine that train just sort of plowing directly into the hill. One issue that's happening with the design of this alignment, this light rail, is that there's a place called Pigeon Point, and if you know what I'm talking about, it's a hill that almost goes directly up to the West Seattle Bridge. And that is, I understand it, is presenting a design challenge. How are you going to deal with that if you're bringing a light rail path directly to the south of the West Seattle Bridge? Are they going to go over it? Are they going to excavate? Are they going to go through it? I don't know. But if that becomes a significant issue during the design process, and they have to go to the north of the West Seattle Bridge, then another possibility would be that you start somewhere in the Terminal 5 area of the tunnel. Now, if that's the case, the tunnel would be very long, so that might be a drawback for that one. So these are not the only options. These are just the options that a group of us that know that portion of West Seattle might suggest. Yes?
I would add, for when you're doing the presentation, I know you're not talking about downrange stuff.
Yep.
But it does seem important to point out that if you, well, in any really of the bottom two, the potential of the tunnel alternative also has the effect of presumably bringing down the height of the rail at that point. It wouldn't need to be at 160 feet because it doesn't need to clear up to the top of it.
That's a true statement. Yeah. So the Delridge alignment is right here at Andover Street. That's where the station is currently depicted, so you know. And because this is a valley, what it looked like Sound Transit engineers thought would be the best thing to do is instead of kind of going down with the terrain and then having to come back up again to shoot over the valley is why they came up with the 160-foot elevation for the track. And as you point out, if you don't need to clear a 50-foot or higher elevation over the road, then you can actually lower that overall track. That's your point. So. Okay, should go to the next. Yes, sir.
The elephant not in the room is just to the right of it. You see the arrow in the upper right-hand corner. How is the train going to get across the Duwamish to arrive at any of these alternatives?
What is in scope is another high-level bridge that goes roughly at the same height as the West Seattle Bridge, which would, on paper, go across to the immediate south of West Seattle Bridge. It is a rail-only bridge. It would only carry trains.
So there's, at this point, no option for carrying buses, which are constantly choked at the entrance to the SR 99, off of the West Seattle Bridge on SR 99.
Correct. I did, so I know we've talked about that,
Yeah.
and I thought it might be interesting to raise that to the head of design. So he thought that it's already difficult, and by the way, I think it's a great idea, so don't get me wrong, I'm going to explain what they said.
Oh.
That making it a support wheel traffic would require the bridge to be wider. So he estimated an additional or total of 24 feet of width would be required in order to carry wheel traffic across the Duwamish through an additional bridge. He believes it is already a design challenge to get even a relatively narrow bridge in that area, partly because of Pigeon Point to the south, but then to the north, there are quite a bit of electrical infrastructure and so on to work your way around. So that was their answer, but I think adding that as a suggestion in the suggestion box in some ways is a great idea.
I have a question. It's on elevation. I mean, the high-level bridge seems way above anything I've ever seen from a boat standpoint. Obviously, the low-level bridge opens up or swings open all the time. It seems like there's an elevation in between the two that might be the sweet spot. I mean, has anyone done a study? Because I just don't see ships that go that high out there.
If I'm not mistaken, the last time that was looked at for passage over the Motley or the cut that goes towards Ballard, there was a maritime requirement of 105 feet, which I think was probably too close to see the bottom of the current highway.
That's not the question. The question is, what is existing out there? What kind of ships are going now? And design, hey, we'll make sure that those ships can continue to go. And you said, hey, maybe it's only 90 feet or whatever. In other words, there's really not that much up to Duwamish. And you got the barge traffic, which is, from a height standpoint, it's not a big issue. I mean, and I've seen a few, sailboats, but 105 feet may be way more than you need at this particular corridor.
Yeah, I think I would recommend that you put that into consideration in terms of the I think to recap what you're saying.
Somebody's just writing it down right there.
To recap what you're saying is, would it be more feasible, maybe less costly, if the bridge were lower than at the same height as West Seattle Bridge. Is that
Yeah.
kind of what you're asking? Maybe, I'm not the engineer, so put it in and maybe that creates some new options. Yes, sir.
We're raising a question here about funding as well.
Yes.
Chaz and I walked the area under the exit from the West Seattle Bridge to 99 and talked to the property owners down there to say, if we widen that curve, how would you respond? And they said, fine, just don't put us out of business. We've been asking for years to expand that to accommodate buses so that we can have a direct line, that C line can run, not have to choke there with traffic, but can run straight around.
It's probably a good time to mention the intent, the Sound Transit's intent, but I think working in coordination with the city, is that buses wouldn't run downtown anymore. And so some buses might, but by and large, the purpose of the buses would be to drop people off at the stations that are headed into downtown. And so the Sound Transit proposal proposes that Delridge and the Junction Station include bus transit connectors. And the idea is that you'd get higher ridership on the light rail if the buses were being used instead of to ferry people past light rail into downtown, but actually we're taking them to the stations is the concept. And also a lot of the operating costs of the buses would be reduced because the buses would no longer have to occupy so much time taking people downtown. So the way you envision, at least the way I'm sort of sharing what I think is their vision, is that through points south in this corridor here, the buses would drop you off at Delridge Station and you make a connection there and then take the train into downtown. And for points south and north here, well, north you might go to Delridge, I'm actually not sure. But certainly points south in this area, you would be actually taking the bus to Junction Station and making a transfer to get onto the train. So that, I believe, is the plan of record.
Excuse me,
Yeah.
I have a question here.
Yes.
That the termination from the Junction Station is where that round circle is, that would be where the totem pole is presently right now on 35th?
This is not, the stations aren't up here. The stations, these are possible entrances to a tunnel.
Okay.
Yeah.
Where would the station terminate for, let's say, the Alaska Junction? Where would that terminate? Where do you propose that?
Where we propose it's the next slide.
Let's go to the next slide.
Okay.
So we propose that the station be located here. If you know where that building is, like what parcels are there, that is the Bank of America building. And across the street from it is a Jiffy Lube and another bank. I think it used to be a
Home Street.
Yeah, now it's Home Street. There's also a new urgent care facility, new urgent care center that's going in where the check cashing place used to be. So if you imagine that location, that's what we favor as the location of Junction Station. And incidentally, that's almost exactly the place where the representative alignment shows it. It's almost exactly the place where the city planned its walk shed around the urban village, which is this location right here. And so our community has been built around that location more or less anyway, so we feel like that's a pretty good spot. It's adjacent to some significant development that's taking place in this area, so it would serve well the rental community that's being built there. We'd probably get some good bus circulation, because right now, the C line runs back and forth along Alaska Street anyway. And if we were actually to use this property as station area, we could imagine adding a bus drop-off lane so that you're not in the middle of traffic when the buses are stopping. They're actually pulling off to the side to let the passengers on and off. Now, if you're going to from the south, and you come up here and turn right, or turn left, you drop off here, and then the buses could circulate in that direction. If you're coming from the other direction, which is the way the C line currently goes downtown, you'd be dropped off headed east. Okay, there's a lot going on in this slide, so I actually want to talk through a few key points of this. One is that you can see is, you might see illustrated here, these little pictures of trees and things. If you remember our design guidelines outlined a preference to have both Alaska Street and Fauntleroy be, I think it was called comfortable at street level for pedestrians.
Pedestrianality.
It would be, I'd say, preferable for us to see trees there instead of concrete pylons. Okay, so that's something that we would prefer. We also know that the triangle is a development opportunity. There's a lot of buildings there that are sort of leftovers from a long time ago, and something that we think we could really be positive is if we started to hit some of our employment and job center figures for the West Seattle Junction, is we could actually imagine the trains, instead of arriving empty and leaving full, might arrive full and leave full. Because if people are actually going to work in the West Seattle Junction, then we think this would be a good location to serve some of the best opportunity for development of employment opportunities there at the junction, there at the triangle. So that's another thing. So what you see is the fulfillment of this desire to have this be a connection between the triangle and the commercial district of the California Avenue, centrally located in basically the epicenter of West Seattle Junction. Something else that's sort of implied there is the word park. So I mentioned earlier that we have an open space issue in the West Seattle Junction. We actually have only 2/100ths of an acre of open space in the West Seattle Junction to serve 4,000 households, which is among the lowest of all urban villages in the city. And so one thing we think would be useful, or an idea, is that if they develop an underground station here, they basically build a big hole in the ground, build a station, and they fill it in again, and they cover over the top. Maybe we could cover that over the top and make it a public area where people can gather. Maybe it's a park, maybe it's a plaza. We could choose that later. But it would really help create a focal point for this area so that people who are out walking their dogs or want to gather or want to have an event, just want to hang out with their friends in the sun, could really serve a pretty nice area around this particular spot. So that's another idea we have. Now, a way you might be able to do that is, if you remember a slide ago, we might need to take some space away from the golf course and the park in order to have a station, in order to build an entrance to the tunnel. And so possibly what we could do is arrange a land swap, I don't know if this is possible, but it sounds like a lot of work, between the Department of Parks and Recreation, which is the city of Seattle, giving some space to Sound Transit in order to have that tunnel opening within the park space, but then getting some park space back in return where the station is actually built. And so that seems like it would be a pretty cool way to try to arrange that.
Did you already point out where the location of the future park is?
There's some park space here. Now, this park space was acquired through the Parks Levy. Hasn't been developed yet. We're going through some planning and design on that right now. If it's already there, then it can tie in with that park. If it's not, then maybe that can be a part of the swap, because that particular park space is, I don't know if the sun actually strikes the ground in that particular location. It might be better located where more people can appreciate it and use it if it is something that's visible and usable from a more main street. So, yes, sir.
Is the assumption with the tunnel plan that there can be no other station, like the 35th and Avalon station? Do you do that?
Here's our position on it, is someone's going to ask you how you're going to pay for all this tunnel work. And so our position is that that Avalon station, it does not have as high a utility and it's not as good to use the taxpayer funds in our view as it would be if we were able to serve the junction from a single station and then reuse some of the investment that was going to go into that Avalon station and use it for tunneling instead. So that's our point of view on that. Yes?
Yeah, I know, early on when we were kind of discussing this, because we're going to, hopefully from the triangle, have a lot of pedestrian activity crossing Fauntleroy over there to get over there. I know we kind of discussed maybe Robbins Government pedestrian crosswalk underground.
Yeah, can you hit the next slide? So if anyone's been to London, you might have gone into the tube there, and a lot of times you actually go underground and you walk under an intersection. You actually walk under streets. And so one concept is maybe we could have entrances to the station that are not, well, in addition to, but at least entrances to the station that are actually on the other side of Fauntleroy. And if we did that, we might be able to reduce some of that pressure on that intersection so we wouldn't get so much foot traffic across Fauntleroy and potentially the river. So in this case, you'd be able to approach the station from the east and be able to enter without crossing that busy
That's a
intersection.
really good idea.
Yep.
That is really good.
That's a good one. So that's one idea. Likewise, this is maybe more of a, if I could wave my magic wand and make something cool happen. Jefferson Jefferson Square has a parking garage. It's just not a very big one. And maybe through private development, the owner of the Jefferson Square area could develop underground parking there and actually develop a more substantial above ground residential and mixed-use building, but then with more substantial underground parking that could actually accommodate both transit parkers, which means people who are going to park there and then get on the station, and then on the weekends, commercial parkers, people who want to park there and then shop at the junction. Okay, and so that would be a really cool use, and now, it's not my property, so I can't say do that, but maybe with some outreach to some owners there so we can get some private and public investment in this area happening at the same time. You could even imagine parking there and then walking underground to the station and never even coming up, right, if it was all underground. Yes?
I'm not sure if it was, you could tell from the drawings from Sound Transit, were the stations, the elevated stations that they proposed, essentially the same footprint as the ones that they like Maple Lake?
Yeah, they're 400 feet long, so they're, if you've ever seen one of the elevated stations, or if you haven't seen one, you should take a look online. You can take a look at Mount Baker Station and Angle Lake. If you actually go there, you can see them in person. They are very large structures. So they're 400 feet long because in order to accommodate for crane cars, they have to be that long so the platform can be that long. And they also have to be, since they're 50 feet above the ground, you also need to have access through elevators and escalators and so on. So I'm not exactly sure how they would fit all that in when it's all supposed to be above the street. But yes, that's the plan.
Including the Avalon proposed is the same size?
Correct.
So people probably have already asked you, with the tunnel and the costs, but, we already have a history of drilling in Beacon Hill, and we already have a history of drilling in Capitol Hill, and,
It seems quite reasonable.
it seems very reasonable. Yeah, it does seem very reasonable.
So yeah.
So we have a history, and we have a precedence for doing it.
Yeah, I agree. I mean, I look at it objectively and say, well, we were able to tunnel under Capitol Hill, we were able to tunnel up through Roosevelt. I talked with that engineer, and so we tunnel under, Sound Transit tunnel under Bellevue. Bellevue chipped in a few $100 million of the cost. In order to get to the Roosevelt Underground Station, they did a cost analysis of both tunnel and above ground, and they concluded that through all the property acquisitions and a bunch of homes needed to be acquired and destroyed, through some stabilization work they would need to do to I-5, that the cost difference was $40 million, and Sound Transit chose to absorb that cost into the project. So it seems reasonable. I don't want to take any chances.
No.
So the question is, are we being responsible with the funding on this, because we know we're in an environment where, I don't know, did you guys get your
Yes.
property tax assessment? It's probably not a good time to go ask the people of Seattle or the people of the region for another property tax levy to help fund a tunnel for, if you see what I mean. Probably not a good time for us to ask the federal administration for additional funds.
That's why we're talking
to
about
support
maybe
that.
eliminating the Avalon as a possible way to mitigate some of the costs of the tunnel.
Precisely. So yeah, I mean, you're exactly right. So we think it would be responsible for us to show that we can make a trade-off that keeps our costs reasonable by taking a station that has limited utility out. And we've already designed the West Seattle Urban Village around the assumption of a 10-minute walk shed to this intersection of Fauntleroy and Alaska. And if we already have designed that with this in mind, then this station location seems to be reasonable. Yes, Monica?
I just want to say that in the last few weeks, this has gotten me real wound up. And so I went down my own rabbit hole in terms of research, looking for what happens in cities where there's high density, and what happens in cities that have great forethought and vision in terms of planning and stuff like this. The Denver model of T-Rex was kind of a, if we build it, they will come. So big stations were put out in the middle of nowhere, and everything grew up around them. But in cities around the world where there's already high density, the stations that are working out well are the ones that are underground. They're not ripping the heart out of the community that they serve, and they're actually, what should I say? They are things that you can live with for generations. And in the course of this research, I'm compiling a most fascinating notebook of above-ground light rail systems that in fact have been abandoned because they didn't work. And Hawaii is a great example of a great light rail station question is, how are we gonna live with it for generations? And I guess I'm saying that the more progressive places around the world are demanding that you go under.
Yes.
So what about the possibility of moving this further east to where you're proposing the tunnel begin to serve this location
And so
here?
like at 35th and,
Yeah, or between, say, Fauntleroy and 35th, or, you know, somewhere around there. And then having the tunnel length, or perhaps, you know, that.
You mean
has there
that
been any-
triangle?
yeah, I think that would be roughly, so,
Right.
there's 35th.
People are here.
Yeah, is
So,
that, is this considered more,
Uh,
it's not that much farther away from where this is?
People are willing to walk a quarter mile to a half a mile on their feet. This is what I do for a living. And you want to have the station centrally located to where the people are. You got the businesses there. This is probably the most centrally located spot that can serve both the Avalon station and the proposed Junction station. This kind of centralizes it. If you're going to cut out the station, like he says, the utility of the Avalon station is modest. And so that's why you couldn't really move it further to the east, because you're moving away from where people want it.
And that is where a lot of the newer big apartments are located also, right around that.
But aren't they going to plan that sort of thing to the east as well?
I don't know.
That edge of 35th is quite steep and only has a park on one side. So it might be more difficult to pick up some of the walk shed. Because it's a little, I don't disagree. I think all the
Yeah,
ideas
I
just go into South
I just ran into
Transit.
that
Yeah.
with the tunnel.
Yeah, I mean, it's probably cheaper because you would need to.
Well, just another
dig a hole.
angle.
Okay.
Do you have another slide?
There's a few more slides, but I think we've mostly talked through them already. You can just tap through to the end.
I have a question.
Yes.
So those of us that take the 21, we are assuming that Metro would then have the 21 turn left on Alaska, so we wouldn't have a two-walk block.
Service from 35th, right?
Yes.
That's what you're talking about. Yeah, I have a slide. I mean,
Yeah,
it's way back in there, but there's a slide depicting the what bus routes going northbound on 35th would do. So instead of proceeding directly north from Alaska, which would then enter to the West Seattle Bridge or presumably to Avalon Station and get tangled up in that, they would make a left. And it's roughly the same distance. It's a little bit shorter to go north, but they both travel through the same number of stoplights. So the idea would be you get circulation, basically have buses that are going like this, okay?
So the only other
You see what I
question
mean?
I have is that at the bottom of Avalon, you have a collector for the C and the 21 that aggregates from Alki, that aggregates from Delridge, and that aggregates from the Junction.
Yep.
You would be losing that transit with no bus service once one is installed. So you need to think, since that is an impact of this plan, you would need to come up with some scheme where that significantly large transit route is not abandoned.
I agree, yeah.
And I'm sure they would be within a half a mile walk of the station, Mark, but I ain't walking uphill half a mile, get really my 21 feet on it.
You're right. I mean, so there's I mean, this is basically what Avalon Station does. Is it's you know, helps serve kind of the top of Avalon. Now, if you're lower on Avalon, you're actually not that far from Delaware Station.
That's true.
Right, so,
Downhill.
yeah, you go downhill and you can, if you were
But
me,
if
just,
you got off of Delridge and lived up near Avalon, all those apartments that are already there, your high density already existed. I'm
Right, right.
pushing back, I'm giving you the issue that you're gonna have to face to sell this.
Yeah.
To at least a half of the Link population here in West Seattle.
I would add to that and address sort of the issues you brought up, that if looking at where some of these proposed tunnels are and perhaps going across the golf course, that if there are possibilities of taking some way off the golf course, there are a number of folks in Delridge who would like to see the Delridge station move further south, closer to the neighborhood. So you begin to get possibilities where perhaps the Delridge station is actually somewhere closer to where 35th and Avalon is currently proposed and begins to serve the people in that tail end of the neighborhood.
yeah, we're good.
Michael, as a person who's played 1,000 rounds of golf there, I support that.
I
really envision if they take out 2 holes at the golf course, people hopping on light rail, going to the Junction Park, playing the 2 holes in the park, and then taking the light rail back to continue the 18 holes.
It'd be a part 2. This is just, if we were to continue the conversation about the broader lens, I also included a slide that shows the 3 stations depicted. And so what we're talking about is, here's Avalon Way. Right? So down here, you're kind of halfway between Delridge and Avalon. This is going to be down a hill. Okay, so walking back, you're walking up that hill instead of walking up that hill. Although if it was me, I know a bike. I would bike down here, take the train, and come back up there and bike down again. But
Yeah.
amazing that way.
And I would also add, Rich,
Yeah.
and I don't know what the thinking was behind it, but the early Sound Transit things designate Delridge, of these 3 stations,
Yeah.
designate Delridge and Alaska Junction, as you said, as transit
Yeah,
access,
correct.
and do not designate Avalon as transit access.
That's right.
So there seems to be thinking on the part of Sound Transit that buses are not expected to stop at Avalon.
Right.
So the only thing I can imagine, because the C line and the 50 both run through the Alaska Junction currently, is that yes, you would turn the 21 and not only maintain that connectivity and access to people for light rail, but you now have increased connectivity that all the folks currently on the 21 who have to transfer to go to the junction now no longer have to transfer, they would have direct bus access into the junction.
This is what you're talking about.
Yeah.
And so this is the current location proposed for Avalon Station. This is the one we just showed you, which is also synonymous with what currently the Sound Transit says is the location there. So your northbound traffic on 35th, you turn left, go through this intersection, and you walk there, or if you go past the Avalon intersection. And then part of the issue I have with this location is it's already so congested with the cars that are getting onto the West Seattle Bridge that you might be able to get a bus in, but you're going to be backed up with some traffic and also trying to get out. So that's a yes, Michael. I agree with you.
Just a final question on the reroute. So one of the things that Metro thinks about when they,
Can you talk a little bit louder?
one of the things that Metro thinks about when they change bus routes is where is that bus going to go when there's a reroute? And if you have the 21, if you're avoiding the 35th Avenue for some reason, in the wintertime, 35th Avenue is basically the clear street in West Seattle. California is not cleared as well as 35th. So that's another issue for bus connectivity, is what are the snow day buses, what are the short run buses, what actually does the system look like after you redefine it? And I think some of our concerns, I know, since you're here, Joe, I can say this to you, has nothing to do with the junction. I think some of our concerns with the 120 vice the H is that even though Link runs down the Rainier Valley, you still have the 7 running every 7 minutes, and you still have the 36 running every 7 minutes. You have 2 buses that are the highest frequency, even of the train. And if you take the 120 and you turn it into an H, you're going to have high frequency, but you're not going to have the stops that the 7 and the 36 have. And that's the concern. Having nothing to do with this, by the way. I support the tunnel, by the way.
Yeah.
Who supports the tunnel? Just curious. Anyone think no tunnel? Say anti-tunnel? Oh, all right, cool. That's it, we just voted.
Right?
Yes, sir.
A couple of questions. One is, if the buses become circulators, it seems like you're expecting everybody to transfer at least once, maybe twice, maybe 3 times to get between West Seattle and downtown. You also seem to be building in an assumption that people will only go downtown on the light rail, which will not be so. And I think you'll be adding more vehicle traffic, single occupancy vehicle traffic to the road because of that. Because the buses are not going to be available, only the light rail will be available, and nobody's going to be going downtown to shop. And
Yeah.
come back, you can't carry anything back. So that's first.
Yeah, go ahead.
And the second one is
me take the second part of that question, then I'll ask you to repeat the first part.
Okay.
November 2016, voters approved a Sound Transit 3 package. And we went out to the ballot, told everybody what the representative alignment was going to be, and what the cost was going to be, what the tax sources to pay that cost were going to be. And we received an overwhelming positive vote from this region endorsing and wanting expansion of light rail throughout the region, ST3. This year, as we sit here now, the legislature is in fact debating whether or not to reduce some of the NVAP, one portion of the Sound Transit revenue, to do that. Do I think that we should tonight talk about what efforts we need to take to address a reduction in Sound Transit revenue based on the legislature's action? No, I don't. Because if we do, and we come up with a plan to eliminate $2 billion of Sound Transit expenses over the next 25 years, the legislature can too easily say, great, they can live without that $2 billion, let's take 5. I think it's premature to start coming out with plans now for how we're going to mitigate exactly what pound of flesh the legislature may take out. For what I might point out is a funding package they gave us the authority to put on the ballot. And second was about making connections to how much rerouting there would be and less connections to downtown versus how many rides. I would argue that you're not going to have a significant increase in single occupancy vehicle traffic going across the West Seattle Bridge because light rail will be much more predictable, will be not stuck in traffic at any point in time from the time you get on light rail, and therefore more reliable. So more people will find it as an option to take into downtown.
And no toll.
And you'll be avoiding the toll in the new tunnel. And to my knowledge, Metro doesn't have detailed plans for what route is going to go to what station and how it's going to make that connection. But yes, Metro, we already have, as we've opened up ULink, light rail service to the University of Washington, rerouted a number of routes that otherwise came downtown. So yes, it is a 2-seat ride. If you're in the north end somewhere, you would take a bus to Husky Stadium or to Capitol Hill and get on light rail then. But then you have a much quicker ride into downtown because you're not stuck in I-5 or you're not stuck on East Lake or however else your bus route to get downtown.
So in effect, you're designing this for commuters more than for people who are, say, going to a movie and dinner or going shopping and want to pack something home. It
I can
sounds
take
like most of the riders you're anticipating are the riders you've proportionally more got now, which is commuters.
I plan on taking light rail downtown for that movie and dinner. And that's very much what light rail will support and enhance. If you're going to go buy a bag of groceries, if you're going to go buy a pair of shoes downtown, you're going to carry that back and forth with you just as you would on the bus. If you're going to go buy a TV, my husband has a hilarious story. It was about Michael tonight, I guess. Michael has a hilarious story, I think it's hilarious, about how he decides one night he needs to go buy a TV. He's in Chicago. He goes out to, living in Chicago at the time, he goes out to some suburb, buys a TV at Target, and then has to figure out how to get the TV home. If you're going to buy a TV, you're not going to take the bus home.
Amazon.com.
It's been more than 20 years since he lived in Chicago, so that wasn't an option at the time.
Yeah.
So that's basically everything that I had to show you today. Presents a bunch of work that Avalon Tom did to help with the renditions. Thank you.
So Rich,
Yes, sir.
so what does JuNO envision as the next steps? Are you packaging this, I assume,
Yeah.
to present as part of comments to Sound Transit?
We do intend to do that.
And so are you looking at any sort of mechanism where sign on and say, yes, look at these tunnel alternatives, yes, this, green space and all these things, this is great, we want you to look at this. Is there some vision for how people would demonstrate that support?
So, great question, thank you. Yeah, I thought that far, I'm just kidding. It's all happening so fast. I mean, March 5th, that deadline is happening, so we're actually exposing this to more people for the first time, and we weren't sure what people would think. What we'd ask is that if you like what you saw, there is a email address to provide input to Sound Transit. The first goal we have is just to get this alternative under consideration. We don't have to win it. We don't have to win any arguments in the next 14 days, but we do have to make sure that a tunnel option with considerations like this is among the alternatives that get considered. So what I would ask is if you like what you saw, to go to there's an email address in the web presentation, but you can also find it online. And Tracy, will you
It's
put WSB link at Sound Transit? Okay. Send an email to there saying something like, "We support the tunnel option that was presented by the Junction."
You could say why. I mean, I think that's
Sure.
part of it. Tell us why.
Oh, are you from Sound Transit?
I am from
Oh,
Sound Transit.
introduce yourself.
Sorry. Michigan with Sound Transit. So yes, we're really hoping that people submit early spoken comments. Go online. There's an online open house too, so that you can see the alignment. You can see what other people have been commenting on the map. We appreciate the engagement and the energy here. So please do go and say why, because it really helps. An alignment may work or it may not work in terms of once you get into engineering or feasibility, but if we hear what your concerns are for the community, whether it's with the elevated, whether it's with location, whether it's your neighborhood, your community, locality, tell us what those things are so that then we can, as we do go into this alternatives process, we can address those and speak back to you and say, this is what we heard from you, here's what we've come up with.
Lita, do you want to give that the email again?
Sure, it's WSB, so West Seattle Ballard, WSB link at soundtransit.org.
Did everyone get that?
WSB. And if you
Link.
go to Sound Transit's website, West Seattle Ballard page, it's all over there.
So thank you. And to maybe more to your
There
point,
it is.
once we start to see
Oh, there it is.
what alternatives and options the community has presented, and maybe from others, then if there's better alternatives or ideas that might modify our point of view, we might say that's great. But if this is the idea that we like, then yeah, absolutely, we're going to have JuNO sessions where we'll have the Junction area itself come together and talk about this. And if we're really in favor of it, then we will be out there helping raise awareness in the community, try to get a bunch of support. Petitions is a great idea. Email campaigns. There's also online web surveys. I know you can actually enter comments on the web as well. So as they go through and start to prioritize among the different alternatives, what we want to do right now is just make sure it's considered. By the time we reach middle of the year, we're going to say we want this to be the preferred alternative, which is, the next step.
Have you brought this to the farmers market? Because those are the people who are really going to be impacted.
It's a great point. We talked about bringing some of Avalon Tom's imagery to the farmers market. There's only 5 of us, so if anybody wants to help, please see us afterwards, and we'll ask for some volunteers who might want to staff a booth or something like that. That would be great.
That would be really good.
But we will. We're doing our best to get the word
Or
out.
how to get a hold of the West Seattle Junction neighborhood organization. Their website is on the agenda.
Thank you very much. Yes, sir.
So, just in terms of cost of this trade-off, do you have a sense of whether it actually works, or is the savings of not having the Avalon station just a drop in the bucket compared to building the tunnel, or would it actually be a significant?
I'm sure the stations have a significant cost, especially if they are underground. If you've seen what they've done at the amount of excavation they have to do in order to create a space for a station, it's quite expensive. The cost of the tunnel, I don't know if you've heard any statistics in terms of what the incremental cost would be.
A single fact, if you, at grade, not elevated, not tunnel, at grade on the surface, and versus tunnel is about 10 times more expensive generically in plotting out, and I don't remember the factor for aerial.
Well, Well, it really just depends, I think, which is probably why you're not thinking of it. It depends on, how.
Yeah, in a
high
very
and all
generic
sorts of
sense.
Factors. So, as we move through this process, that's the kind of information we'll be able to bring forward.
But there's already 2 tunnel borers and Bertha.
Bertha's gonna live
Well,
underground.
the tunneling itself is not the expense, it's the stations that are the big expense.
So, I'd say,
Tunneling is an expense as well.
Yeah, but you got to call compared to the columns and right-of-way savings.
Tunneling is, this is a guess, and I should hesitate to do this. At grade, if that's a factor of 1, elevated, I want to guess, is 2 or 4 times as expensive. And as I said, tunneling is 10 times as expensive. So 10 times as expensive as at grade, more than twice as expensive as aerial. And I'm going out on a limb by even saying 2 or 4 times. But there's a significant more expense, and we don't, speaking as Sound Transit, when I say we at this moment, we don't own tunnel boring machines. We contract with contractors to do the work. So we don't have tunneling machines sitting in our warehouse right now with all their work.
I was left with that impression.
yeah, so I think it's a great question. Now, consider that the Roosevelt,
That's okay.
answers.
Okay, no, sorry.
They had to go through enough design to understand like how much it's going to cost through property acquisition and so on before we understood what the Roosevelt station was going to cost. So I imagine that there's a bunch of design. So we save a bunch of costs by going underground, property acquisition, some demolition, some eminent domain or offers placed on properties. So we'd avoid a bunch of costs. We'd also avoid a bunch of environmental impacts, noise, potential mediation costs related to people who live immediately adjacent to stations and tracks. So it might be by the time you do all the math, it might net out pretty close, but we won't know until we get into some of the, this is my assumption, until we get further down into the design processes, which is why we have to have multiple alternatives in play.
And want all of your best ideas on the table now so we can explore all of those. And to have the most vibrant, successful, empowered West Seattle we can possibly have, we need those ideas now. And my vision is very much to have a tunnel serving the junction. Exactly where and how and the specifics and how to pay for it. That's what the next year is about, is working on all those. But finding a way to preserve the character, the vibrancy of the junction as we all know it today is a priority that I bring to the table and will bring with me to my work at the Elected Leaders Group as well, to make sure that we're doing all we can to bring that reality and that empowerment to West Seattle.
Thank you.